All right, my assignment this morning is to give you roughly 200 years of Quaker history in about 65 minutes or so, which by my math comes to something like 3.5 years a minute. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Basically, if you're looking at Quakerism over the last 2 centuries, there are 4 themes that I think stand out. The first of these is how Quakers become increasingly diverse in their beliefs, in their practices, in their modes of worship. Secondly, you find that Quakers, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of Quakers over the past 200 years have acculturated. They become more comfortable with the world around them. They dress and speak at least like other people around them. None of us I see this morning is in a broad-brimmed hat or a plain bonnet. And that is a change from what you would have seen here at Fairfield 200 years ago. Third theme, which is in large part a result of the first 2, is conflict. Over the past 2 centuries, Quakers have put considerable energy into arguing, disputing, debating, even fighting each other. And the result of that has been, in turn, increased diversity. As you will see from this simplified family chart up here, the different strains of Quakerism that have emerged in America over the past 200 years. Fourth and final theme, and this is one that is extremely important, and it's mainly one for the last 150 years or so, that Quakerism has become international. 200 years ago, just about all of the world's Quakers, certainly all of the organized Friends meetings, would have been found either in the British Isles or in North America. Today, as I assume a lot of you know, a majority of the world's Friends live in Africa and Latin America. So that's a major change, and it's one that we're still trying to sort out the implications of today. Okay. Well, how do we get here? Well, a starting point for understanding the diversification of world Quakerism, especially American Quakerism, comes in the 1820s with the first of the great splits or separations that Friends are going to experience. I hope I'm not messing you up. I tend to move around a little. And that is the Hicksite separation. At the center of this is a Quaker minister from Long Island, whose name was Elias Hicks. He was born in 1748. He was recorded a minister when he was a rather young man in the 1770s. So by the 1820s, he is an old man, past the age of 70. He's widely known, certainly by the standards of the 1820s. He's a widely known Quaker minister. He's traveled widely among Friends from New England west to Ohio, spent a lot of time in the Delaware Valley. So he's a very public figure. By the 1820s, however, Elias Hicks has also become the center of considerable controversy. And this is because by the 1820s, he's developed a set of ideas about Quakers and Quakerism, which he is very forward about advocating. Elias Hicks's first argument is his conviction that Quakers have become too comfortable with the world. They are becoming too much like their non-Quaker neighbors. They have been overly influenced by ties they have developed in business or politics or even promoting good causes like education or anti-slavery, that have made them increasingly less distinctive, less peculiar. When Elias Hicks looks at Quakerism in the 1820s, he sees Methodism and Presbyterianism and Episcopalianism creeping in, corrupting the Quaker world. Therefore, Elias Hicks argues that what American Friends needs is a reformation to return to primitive Quakerism by emphasizing distinctiveness, by being much more wary of ties with the larger world. Combined with this commitment to a primitivist reformation is a set of theological precepts that Elias Hicks has developed and begun to preach by the 1820s. And it's the theology that really gets him into trouble with other friends. First of all, Elias Hicks argues that largely because of those non-Quaker influences, especially coming from evangelical denominations like the Presbyterians and Methodists, the Quakers are giving too much power. They are according too much influence to the Bible, to the letter. Hicks argues that one of the foundations of Quakerism is continuing revelation and the guidance of the inner light. Certainly, he doesn't dismiss the Bible. If you look at Hicks's writings and his sermons, and we've got transcripts of many of his sermons, more than for any other 19th century Quaker minister, they are steeped in scripture. He can recite whole chapters of the Bible from memory. So this is somebody who has looked at and very carefully studied the Bible. But that study of the Bible convinces him in turn that the Spirit is paramount, and that in fact giving too much authority to the Bible has led to corruption and abuses. All you have to do is look at the United States in the 1820s, and you find so-called Christians using the Bible to justify war and slavery. For Hicks, that is corruption. Indeed, he goes so far as to say that there have been times when he has wondered if the world would have been better off if the Bible had never been written, because of the ways that it is used to justify evil practices in the world. That is something that some friends find convincing. It is something that other friends in the 1820s find to be terrible, horrible heresy. Combined with this is Hicks's Christology, his view of the nature of Jesus Christ, the place of Jesus Christ in the Christian religion. Hicks's study of the Bible and the leadings of the light have led him to the conviction that the man Jesus who lived 2,000 years ago was not born the Christ. Jesus became the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, because he was the only man who has ever lived who was completely obedient to the light within him. That is what made him the Son of God. Implicit in that is a dismissal of traditional Christian doctrines like the virgin birth. Again, there are some friends who find this to be sound, traditional, primitive Quaker teaching. Other friends who are horrified by this as yet another terrible heresy. By the mid-1820s, American Quakers are dividing largely over how they respond to the teachings of Elias Hicks. Those who support Elias Hicks, who think that he is a model of Quaker ministry, become known as Hicksites, although that's never a name that they use for themselves. They just say that they are Quakers or primitive Quakers. Those who oppose Elias Hicks, who think that he is a dangerous heretic, if not an infidel and atheist, become known as Orthodox Friends. There are attempts by Orthodox Friends in New York and in Philadelphia, where Hicks often visits, to silence him. Those attempts do not succeed. Yet they gain such strength so that by 1827, 1828, you see a series of separations in 5 of the 8 yearly meetings of Friends in North America. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Ohio, and Indiana yearly meetings all split into new yearly meetings, or each claiming to be the original yearly meeting. So you now have 2 groups in Philadelphia calling themselves Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, 2 in New York, 2 in Baltimore, 2 in Ohio, 2 in Indiana. This is a dynamic that has endured down to the present day. Even today, there are some places like Indiana where the 2 groups have never reconciled. They have continued on separate paths. Overall, we estimate that about probably 40% of American Quakers sided with Elias Hicks, probably about 60% with the Orthodox. Hicksites are a majority in New York, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore yearly meetings, probably close to 40–45% in Ohio, only about 20% here in Indiana. There are 3 other yearly meetings, New England, Virginia, and North Carolina, that don't split. They remain entirely identified with the Orthodox. And it's also important that the 2 other yearly meetings, Dublin and London, also recognize the Orthodox Friends as being the legitimate Friends. They repudiate Hicksite Friends as being non-Quakers. They're simply Hicksites, since they do not acknowledge the divinity of Christ and the authority of Scripture. We cannot have any ties with them. Now, this is not a peaceful separation. It is indeed bitter in many places, and the consequences of that bitterness are going to linger for decades. Even before the 2 sides begin formally splitting away from each other, they engage in print and pamphlet wars that very often descend into attacks on personalities and the most vitriolic language. When separations actually take place, the 2 sides, in many places, contend for possession and control of meeting houses and other property. And this can be exciting, to say the least. At Blue River Meeting in southern Indiana, there is a tradition that the Hicksites put a small cannon in the meeting house to keep the Orthodox out. In Ohio yearly meeting, Mount Pleasant in eastern Ohio, when the separation took place during yearly meeting sessions, the 2 sides got into a fight over possession of the clerk's table that resulted in a riot that, among other things, resulted in the gallery collapsing and the clerk's table being broken apart and the clerk himself suffering 3 broken ribs in the melee. At Duck Creek, close to where I grew up in Henry County, Indiana, one friend, William Bond, stormed out of a business meeting, vowing that, quote, Elias Hicks is as good a man as Jesus Christ, and certain approved ministers in this meeting ought to be shot. These are not always friendly friends. To exacerbate the bitterness, the Orthodox feel it their duty formally to disown every Hicksite friend, to pass sentences of basically excommunication, announcing to the world that these people are no longer friends. And sometimes that leads to ridiculous situations. A good example would be Wrightstown monthly meeting in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It was about 90% Hicksite. There were only 4 male friends there who identified with the Orthodox. Yet those 4 men still considered themselves to be the legitimate Wrightstown monthly meeting, and they disowned something like 157 Hicksite friends as not being legitimate friends. And of course, the Hicksites have children, so even into the 1840s and 1850s, as these Hicksite children born before the separation come of age, they find themselves being visited by committees of Orthodox friends, urging them to see the error of their ways, and when they don't, disowning them as well. So this really continues on for decades. Well, the two sides take different conclusions. They draw different lessons from this experience. The conclusion that the Orthodox draw from their experience in the 1820s is threefold. First of all, this mess has developed because the Orthodox had been too long-suffering. They had been too tolerant of Elias Hicks's heresies. If they had disowned him, say, in 1815 or 1819, we wouldn't be facing these problems. So lesson number one for Orthodox friends: whenever dissent develops, you lower the strong hand of the discipline on it immediately. Dissent is dangerous. Diversity should not be tolerated. Second conclusion that the Orthodox draw from this is that much of Elias Hicks's appeal is due to the fact that Quakers don't really understand the Bible. At least those who follow Elias Hicks don't really understand the Bible. So we need to put much more emphasis on biblical teaching. So you have groups like the Bible Association of Friends in America being formed to make sure that every Quaker family in America has a complete copy of the authorized version of the Bible. And closely related to this is the third lesson that Orthodox friends take away from these controversies, that we need to raise our children according to the strictest standards of Quakerism. So that leads to a new emphasis on Quaker schools and an innovation, the first day school for scriptural instruction. By the 1830s, Orthodox friends are developing what are essentially Quaker versions of Sunday school, where Orthodox teachings can be inculcated in the rising generation. Hicksite friends draw rather different conclusions from this. And the Hicksites are a more motley group. Some of them, like Elias Hicks, are definite conservatives who believe that Orthodox friends are innovators who have been overly influenced by non-Quakers. They want to hold unyieldingly to the old ways. On the other hand, there are some Hicksite friends who come out of the 1820s as genuine religious liberals. Probably the best example of this would be Lucretia Mott in Philadelphia, who argues that we should have truth for authority and not authority as truth. That we should be open to truth wherever we see it, and that may even be among Presbyterians or Methodists or other non-Quakers. And there's no question that probably some Hicksite friends were simply indifferent. They went with the majority in their meeting. Favorite example of that is a friend in Dutchess County, New York. When he was asked why he sided with the Hicksites rather than the Orthodox in his meeting, His response was that the Hicksites had the better horse stalls at their meeting, and he was thinking about his horse. So, in short, you have Orthodox friends who are committed to uniformity because they think that's what God is requiring of them, and you have Hicksite friends who are much more diverse and are going to develop conflicts because of that. Everybody with me so far? I mean, this is a lot of time on the 1820s, but you have to understand this to understand everything that happens after that. Well, over the next 3 decades, American friends continue what one English friend called their genius for division. Some of these divisions were over how involved friends should be in reform movements in the larger American society. Quakers, for example, have a long-standing opposition to slavery. By the 1830s, a radical new anti-slavery movement advocating the immediate abolition of slavery in the United States is developing. Some friends, both Orthodox and Hicksite, consider it simply acting on Quaker principles to join with non-Quakers, Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, to crusade against slavery. There are other friends, both Orthodox and Hicksite, who believe that if Quakers join with non-Quakers in reform groups like this, they endanger Quaker distinctiveness and peculiarity. So the result, beginning around 1843, is a new round of separations. Among Orthodox friends, you have a separation in Indiana yearly meeting of the most radical abolitionists who split up to form Indiana yearly meeting of anti-slavery friends. Among the Hicksites, you find supporters of abolition who are also interested in other radical reforms, like women's rights. You know, the first women's rights convention in American history was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, summer of 1848. 4 of the 5 women who issued the call for that convention to meet were Hicksite women, including Lucretia Mott. The first women's rights convention here in Indiana was held in the town of Dublin, Quaker community, in 1851. Almost everybody who was involved in that was a Hicksite friend. So Hicksites are involved in a lot of radical reform movements. There are other Hicksites who consider that to be orthodox error, mixing with the world's people, going to lead to problems. So you have splits among Hicksites. The progressive friends, as they call themselves, split off to support various radical causes. Meanwhile, the Orthodox are experiencing an even more important division. It begins in the 1830s, continues in the 1840s and 1850s. And this is a split into Gurneyite and Wilburite friends. The label Gurneyite comes from Joseph John Gurney. He's an English Quaker minister born in 1788, comes from a very wealthy banking family that makes its home at Earlham Hall outside of Norfolk. And Joseph John is not the only prominent member of his family. I assume a lot of you have heard of his older sister, Elizabeth Fry, who is well known as a prison reformer. Joseph John is well educated for a Quaker. Technically, he could not enroll at Oxford University because he wasn't a member of the Church of England, but he took up residence there, was tutored by Oxford tutors, and got the equivalent of an Oxford education by the time he was 22 years old. By the time he's 30, he's been recorded a minister. He is eloquent, he is charismatic, he is handsome, and he exercises a profound influence in London yearly meeting. Gurney believes that Quakerism by the 1820s and 1830s is in need of reform. But his vision of reform is almost diametrically opposed to that of Elias Hicks. First of all, Gurney encourages English Quakers, and in turn American Quakers, to join with non-Quaker evangelical Christians in good causes. So Joseph John Gurney is an officer in the English and Foreign Bible Society to distribute free copies of the Bible around the world. He's involved in prison reform. He's involved in abolition. He's involved in education societies, basically to set up schools for the children of the poor who can't afford to pay tuition. And all of these things he works very happily with bishops and archbishops of the established Church of England. Gurney also believes that Friends need to rethink some of their theology. And there are two doctrines that Gurney emphasizes in particular. One is the authority of Scripture over the authority of the inner light. Gurney, by his own account, struggled with the very concept of the inward light, the idea that there could be a divine light in a person who is not a converted Christian. He finally accepts it, but with a significant reservation. Gurney writes that the light within us, the inward light, compared with the light that is given to us by Scripture, is like the light of the moon at night compared with the light of the midday sun. The Bible is the midday sun, the inner light is moonlight. It is light, but it is definitely less powerful, less instructive. Gurney's second innovation is in the nature of Christian life. And here I need to get into some fairly abstruse theology. Before Gurney, Friends believed that the nature of Christian life was to gradually grow into holiness or sanctification by living the plain life, by attending worship, by constantly looking in to the nature, the setting, the experiences of your own soul, and being guided by the light that is within you. This will gradually lead you to grow into holiness, and that holiness will make you acceptable to God. That will make you justified in the eyes of God, so when you die, you go to heaven. That is very different from what evangelical Christians in Gurney's day and today would believe. They would argue that Christians become justified in the sight of God by being born again, by being saved, by accepting Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, by acknowledging you are saved through the power of the blood that Jesus Christ shed on the cross, his atoning sacrifice. And Gurney leans heavily in that direction. He argues that all friends should undergo an experience of conversion or justification. Then, when they have made themselves acceptable to God by accepting the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, they will go on and grow in holiness or sanctification. So a great argument among 19th century friends, one that I'm guessing few of you have given much attention to today, is whether justification precedes, is coincident with, or is subsequent to sanctification. That's pretty abstruse to most folks today, but for 19th century Quakers, it's extremely important. Final element that's important in Joseph John Gurney's thinking is that he urges friends to rethink their long-standing opposition to higher education. Now, the universities that exist in England in the early 19th century are, of course, two, Oxford and Cambridge. They exist for two purposes. A majority of their students are aristocrats who come to university to meet other young aristocrats and to polish their skills as gentlemen. The acquisition of knowledge is not a priority. For a minority of students in the universities, they are there to study theology to prepare to be priests in the Church of England. Neither of these, of course, would be attractive to friends. Aristocratic polish is definitely vain and unplain. Preparing to be a hireling priest in the Church of England is anathema to all sound friends. But Joseph John Gurney argues there is a third way, that higher education can be definitely useful to friends, and friends should develop their own version of that. English friends will never open their own colleges or universities, but of course, American friends will. And all of the Quaker colleges or universities in the United States today, with the exception of Swarthmore, which is founded by Hicksites, all of the others, Earlham, Haverford, Bryn Mawr, Guilford, Wilmington, William Penn Friends University, George Fox, Whittier, Barclay, Malone, all of these come out of the Gurneyite tradition of Quakerism. Well, most friends in England, the overwhelming majority, and a majority of Orthodox friends here in the United States, probably about 3/4 of them, are attracted to Joseph John Gurney's teaching. They like the direction he is proposing for Quakerism. They think that his vision of a reformed Quakerism is sound, both according to the standards of traditional friends and the standards of Orthodox Christianity. But there is a minority of Orthodox friends who see Joseph John Gurney as a dangerous innovator. They like to quote one of his opponents in London Yearly Meeting, a minister named Thomas Shillitoe, who says that quite simply, Joseph John Gurney is an Anglican who has been overly influenced by the Anglican clergy with whom he is associated. And on his deathbed, Thomas Shillitoe calls in a scribe to take down his dying testimony against the corruptions of Joseph John Gurney. Well, here in North America, the critics of Joseph John Gurney and Gurneyism find their leader in a Rhode Island minister named John Wilbur. Wilbur's born in 1774, recorded a minister while he's still in his 20s, is a leader in New England Yearly Meeting. In 1832, he feels led by the Spirit, with the approval of New England Yearly Meeting, to visit the British Isles. And what he sees there horrifies him. He's convinced that Joseph John Gurney is just as bad as Elias Hicks, that they are both heretics at opposite ends of the spectrum of heresy. Well, in 1837, Joseph John Gurney felt led to pay a visit to North America. He spent 3 years here, and he visited almost every Orthodox Quaker community in North America. Most Orthodox friends are deeply impressed by him. They like his charismatic personality. They are moved by his ministry. They are impressed by reading the books that he has written. When Joseph John Gurney gets to New England, however, John Wilbur considers it his duty to follow Joseph John Gurney around and set Friends straight about what his heresies are. As far as I can tell, they never actually confronted each other directly in the same meeting for worship. Instead, it's the sort of thing that if Joseph John Gurney was in New Bedford in January, John Wilbur will show up there in February to set Friends straight on what real Quakerism is. Most New England Friends find this unacceptable. By 1845, John Wilbur has been disowned by New England Yearly Meeting, but he does not accept that. He and his followers split off to form what they say is the legitimate New England Yearly Meeting. It consists of only about 10% of all New England Friends, but in many places that 10% promptly proceeds to disown the 90% of Gurneyites for following error and being followers of this heretical minister from England, Joseph John Gurney. In most places, the Gurneyites are the overwhelming majority. There is no Wilburite separation here in Indiana Yearly Meeting among Orthodox Friends. There is only a very tiny one in New York or Baltimore Yearly Meetings. Doesn't affect North Carolina or Virginia Yearly Meetings. It does, however, have a profound impact in two other Yearly Meetings, the Orthodox Philadelphia and Ohio Yearly Meetings. In both places, supporters of John Wilbur are a majority. And the problem they face is they have to decide which of these two New England Yearly Meetings they're going to recognize as the legitimate one. In Ohio, the clerk of the Yearly Meeting, a Wilburite sympathizer who, ironically, was actually a native of England, his name is Benjamin Hoyle, he tries to put off a decision for several years. But finally, in 1854, it can't be avoided. A separation takes place in Ohio Yearly Meeting. So you now have three different Ohio Yearly Meetings, Orthodox, Gurneyite, and Wilburite. The Orthodox Philadelphia Yearly Meeting makes a different decision. Wilburites are a majority there, but they also recognize that a lot of their smartest, most active, most vibrant young friends sympathize with Gurney, and they don't want to cast them out. So Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Orthodox decides that the solution to this problem is we will simply cut off all ties with the rest of the Quaker world. That way, we don't have to decide which is the legitimate Ohio or Philadelphia Yearly Meetings. Nevertheless, when Gurneyite ministers from other Yearly Meetings show up in Philadelphia, they're pushed to the back of the meeting house. When Wilburite ministers visit Philadelphia, they are faced on the top row of the facing benches in seats of honor. So Philadelphia Friends make it very clear where their sympathies lie. Gurneyites, though, are an overwhelming majority of Orthodox Friends. Indeed, by the year 1860, it's probably safe to say that about 2/3 of all American Quakers identify with the Gurneyite branch of Quakerism. And by the 1860s, you're seeing a new generation of Gurneyite leaders emerge who advocate what they call a renewal of Quakerism. And this is a movement that is based in very large part here in Indiana, in the Orthodox Indiana and then Western Yearly Meeting, which had been set off from Indiana in 1858. Includes leaders in a Western Yearly Meeting like the first clerk of the Yearly Meeting, Barnabas C. Hobbs, and especially friends in Richmond, like Charles and Rhoda Coffin, or Timothy Nicholson, or Daniel Hill, or Alan Jay, a friend who lives both up in Tippecanoe County and then later in Richmond. These young Gurneyite friends, and young is relative here, these are people in their 30s or 40s. Barnabas C. Hobbs was approaching 50 by the 1860s. They argue that Quakerism can remain distinctive, but at the same time adapt itself to a changing American society. They argue that Friends should accept, they should embrace higher education. So it's Philadelphia Gurneyites who opened Haverford College in 1856. 3 years later, Indiana yearly meeting turns its boarding school in Richmond into Earlham College, making it the second Quaker college in the world. These leaders of Gurneyite renewal also want to see a relaxation of the discipline. They want to do away with some of the strictest rules. So, for example, they argue that Friends certainly should embrace simplicity in the way that they dress. But that doesn't necessarily mean a Quaker uniform where the breadth of your hat brim is measured to see how plain it is. The broader your hat brim, the plainer you were. In the same way, an understanding has developed, and I've never found an explanation of it, that a Quaker woman's bonnet, if it is round in the back, that is plain. But if it is square in the back, it is not plain, and the wearer is probably on the road to doing something really deplorable, like going to a Methodist revival meeting. So in short, we can relax some of these rules about plainness. Gurneyites are also supporters of allowing tombstones in Quaker burying grounds. And probably the most important reform that they advocate is relaxing the rule on marriage, allowing Quakers to marry non-Quakers if their hearts lead them in that way. So by the 1860s, the Gurneyite yearly meetings are revising their disciplines in these lines, relaxing some of the harshest of the old rules. At the same time, however, these advocates of Gurneyite renewal argue that Friends should remain distinctive. Worship should remain unprogrammed on a basis of waiting silence. Friends should be advocates of the right of women to be ministers just as men are among Friends. Many Gurneyite Friends are involved in the women's rights movement as well. And these advocates of Gurneyite renewal also argue that Friends should keep up their commitment to reform causes, to anti-slavery, to supporting the rights of Native Americans. And probably the one that Friends are most united in the 19th century is support for the temperance movement and for the prohibition, the complete outlawing of the liquor traffic in the United States. By the late 1860s, this movement is bearing fruit. Not only are fewer Friends being disowned, but you are finding evidence that in at least some communities, disowned Friends are returning. They are joining meetings that had cast them out 10 or 20 years earlier because they had had a musical instrument in the house or they had married a non-Friend. So this renewal movement is showing encouraging signs. By the mid-1870s, though, a competing movement has developed among Gurneyite Friends. Starts here in the Ohio Valley in Ohio and Indiana, but eventually spreads throughout the Gurneyite Quaker world in North America. And this is the revival movement. And the result of that are scenes like these. Spiceland, Indiana, 1873. There were a number engaged in exhortation and vocal supplication, besides many others singing, while others were down at the mourners' benches and most of the rest on their feet, who had arisen at the call of the preacher, all going on at the same time. Meanwhile, children and even young women, evidently terrified and wild with fright, were crying, women hastening through among the men, and men among the women. Or Bear Creek, Iowa, 1877. Benjamin B. Hyatt, leading a revival, called on all those who wished to lead a new life to come to the front seats. About 20 people scrambled forward, some climbing over the benches. Friends who remained at their seats were visited there by others and had prayer groups form around them. Some prayed aloud, some wept, some broke out in anguished testimonies, some sang snatches of hymns. Horrified conservative friends began to move toward the doors of the meeting house. As they did, one elderly woman climbed up on a bench and spoke in meeting for the first and only time in her life. The Society of Friends is dead. How did this happen? Well, if you want the long version, you can read my first book that's called The Transformation of American Quakerism. The short movement is that a group of Gurneyite ministers, people like David B. Updegraff in Eastern Ohio, John Henry Douglas in Western Ohio, Esther Frame here in Kansas, were deeply influenced by a movement outside of Quakerism, the holiness movement that developed in American Protestantism in the mid-19th century. Holiness advocates argued that all Christians should have two definite experiences. The first of these is being definitely born again or justified, where through a single act of faith in the atoning sacrifice, the blood of Christ shed on the cross, you become acceptable to God. Then you go on to a second instantaneous experience of being sanctified, where the sinful nature within you that might lead you to fall back into sin is utterly removed from within you. Both of these are instantaneous experiences that are most likely to take place under impassioned revival preaching. And this is a movement that sweeps through the Gurneyite yearly meetings. The only one that isn't affected is Baltimore yearly meeting. And this has a profound impact. It changes the nature of worship. Advocates of holiness revivalist Quakerism have no use for silence. Nobody has ever been born again as the result of sitting silently in a meeting. Conversions are the result of preaching. Sanctification is the result of preaching. Silence is wasted time. And so you find a new emphasis on preaching that by the 1890s is giving us the pastoral system among friends, to make sure that there is always preaching going on in a friends meeting. Holiness friends find that hymns and singing can be aids to the new birth, to sanctification, and so music becomes part of Quaker worship, at least Gurneyite Quaker worship. And by the 1880s, just about all of the old distinctives of Quaker life have been swept away. No longer is there an expectation that Quaker dress will be different from their neighbors. No longer is there an expectation that friends will use the plain language of thee and thy. And as the revival expands in power, it draws in a lot of converts from non-Quaker background who have no understanding of traditional Quakerism. And so other traditional Quaker testimonies like racial equality or the peace testimony are accordingly weakened. You won't be surprised to learn that there are some Gurneyite friends who are horrified by all of this. And the result is, beginning in 1877, a new round of separations. Here in Western Yearly Meeting, in Iowa, to a smaller extent in Indiana, in Kansas, in upstate New York. The more conservative Gurneyites who can't accept revivalism split off to form meetings of what they call conservative friends. Now, it's natural that these conservative Gurneyite separatists would have an affinity with the Wilburites, who had separated from the Gurneyites 40 years before or more. But the Wilburites, especially the ones in Ohio, are very slow to accept the Gurneyite conservatives. For example, it's not until 1918 that Iowa Wilburites joined with Iowa conservatives. Generally, Wilburites believed for a long time that the Gurneyite conservatives have lingered too long among the errors of Gurneyism, and we need to take a few decades to make sure that they got all of that poison out of it. So the result is now that you have several strains of Quakerism. Progressive friends by the 1870s pretty much disappeared. Hicksites are on the road that will take them to form the Foreign Friends General Conference in 1900. But among Orthodox Friends, you have Gurneyites, you have Wilburites, you have conservatives, and among the main Gurneyite body, you have a variety of strains, including a group I call a middle party. Includes folks like Barnabas C. Hobbs here in Western Yearly Meeting, people in Richmond, Indiana, like Charles and Rhoda Coffin, Alan Jay, the faculty of Earlham College, who on the one hand are not exactly enthusiastic about the revival, but on the other do not want another round of separations. They see genuine life coming out of the revival, so they feel it their duty to remain with the larger body of friends and to try to soften the edges of revivalism, to guide it, eventually the pastoral system, into more acceptable channels. By the 1880s, many holiness revival friends are hardening into theological positions that we associate with fundamentalism. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. There are others, most notably David B. Updegraff in Eastern Ohio, whose biblical literalism have led them to embrace physical or outward sacraments, grape juice and bread for communion, water baptism. David B. Updegraff gets himself baptized by a Baptist minister in Philadelphia in 1884. They argue that friends should tolerate tender consciences who believe it their duty to observe outward sacraments. For reasons that are still not entirely plain to me, and I've been thinking about this for 40 years, most Gurneyites are not willing to go that far. They cannot embrace outward sacraments. And the controversy over this leads the Gurneyite yearly meetings, along with Gurneyite sympathizers from Philadelphia and official representatives from London yearly meeting, in 1887 to hold a conference in Richmond, Indiana, to try to sort out all of these innovations. Two important results come out of that Richmond conference in 1887. The first is a declaration of faith, deeply evangelical in its views of the nature of Christianity and the nature of Quakerism. Today, evangelical fundamentalist friends generally hold the Richmond Declaration of Faith up as a standard that they would impose on all friends. Something I like to point out to smug Philadelphia and English friends is that the Richmond Declaration of Faith was written almost entirely by three friends. The main leader was an English Quaker minister, Joseph Bevan Braithwaite. His assistants were a friend from Baltimore yearly meeting named James C. Thomas, and a friend from Philadelphia yearly meeting, the president of Bryn Mawr College, James E. Rhodes. So it's Baltimore, Philadelphia, and London that give us the Richmond Declaration, not all of we pastoral friends out here in the Ohio Valley. After 1900, the distinctive ways of Friends become even more pronounced. London Yearly Meeting, the birthplace of Gurneyism, after 1890 becomes increasingly liberal in its theology, particularly because of the influence of a new generation of young Friends. People like John Wilhelm Rowntree, or Porter Catchpole, or Joan Mary Fry, who de-emphasize the necessity of the new birth, indeed emphasize that it is the inner light that is the distinctive feature of Quaker faith. Another important development that begins in the late 19th century and is going to have extraordinary power in the 20th is the development of a missionary movement among Gurneyite Friends. This develops simultaneously in the British Isles and in North America. By 1866, English Friends are sending Quaker missionaries to Madagascar and to India. By 1870, you're finding the Gurneyite yearly meetings in North America forming missionary associations who send missionaries first to Mexico, then to Jamaica, also to work among Native Americans. Of course, the most important missionary work is going to develop after 1900, when American Friends send missionaries first to East Africa, to the British colony of Kenya, and then into Central and South America. It's that missionary work that explains why a majority of the world's Friends today live in Africa and South America. And in those yearly meetings of Friends, you will find preserved in large part the holiness type of Quakerism that the first missionaries brought there a century ago. In Friends in the Hicksite tradition, in 1900, they come together to form Friends General Conference. And this is an organization that exists largely for two purposes. The first is to hold an annual gathering where friends of a liberal mind can get together. The second is to support various types of humanitarian or philanthropic work. Indeed, Friends General Conference was originally called the Friends Union for Philanthropic Labor. And generally, Friends General Conference has seen the foundation of its Quaker vision as tolerance and inclusion. As long as you think you are following the light that is within you, that is good enough. And for a lot of friends in FGC today, that doesn't necessarily even mean you are following a divine light. I'm sure you've heard of the concept of spiritual but not religious. Friends in Friends General Conference are probably one of the three most important influences in the development of that. If you're interested in that, a former student of mine, Isaac Barnes May, just published a wonderful book called God Optional Religion, which is about Quakers, Unitarians, and Reformed Jews, and this idea of spiritual without being religious. Among conservative friends, and Wilburites, there you would find considerable diversity. Most conservative friends today, particularly in the small yearly meetings of Iowa and North Carolina, are theologically quite liberal. They have been transformed by people drawn to silent Quaker worship who didn't necessarily buy into older Quaker Christocentric theology. On the other hand, if you look at Ohio yearly meeting of conservative friends, there you would still find in a few places friends who wear the plain dress, who still use the plain language. There's one meeting ridge south of Barnesville, Ohio, where the men and women still sit on separate sides of the meeting house for worship. And you would find some friends in the vicinity of Barnesville who would tell you that they are the only true Quakers left in the world, kept up as a witness by God. It's among the Gurneyites that you find the greatest ongoing controversy. The conferences that began in Richmond in 1887 led to a series of subsequent conferences every 5 years that in 1902 formed the 5 years meeting of Friends, which was designed to bring all of the Gurneyite yearly meetings under one authority. By this time, however, a reaction has developed to holiness revival Quakerism, particularly in Quaker colleges like Wilmington, Guilford, Earlham, and Haverford, where of course the revival has not reached. These friends who are skeptical about revivalism, yet remain part of the 5 years meeting, find probably their three most important leaders in Philadelphia friend Rufus Jones, North Carolina friend Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, and Indiana friend Albert Russell, who's from West Newton, just down the road from us, spends 20 years teaching the Bible at Earlham. They have no use for revivalism. They have no use for the fundamentalism that is developed among holiness friends. And so they argue that what friends need is a return to historic Quakerism, one that is based on continuing revelation, on respect for learning and education, and particularly on the leading and influence of the inner or inward light. That for them is the central point, the heart of Quakerism. There are other friends for whom this is simply wishy-washy. It's not true biblical Christianity. So for most of the 20th century and going into the 21st, the 5 years meeting, which in 1960 becomes Friends United meeting, has seen constant conflict between these two outlooks, with, truth to be told, probably a majority of the members not caring a whole lot one way or another what the leaders were fighting over. By the 1940s, some friends in the 5 years meeting have become convinced that it is hopelessly contaminated with liberalism and modernism, and so they split off to join or to form the Evangelical Friends Alliance, which eventually becomes Evangelical Friends International. And that sorting has continued into the 21st century. Those of you here in Western Yearly Meeting know that a number of monthly meetings have left Western Yearly Meeting because they consider their own salvation threatened through association with friends who were not born-again Christians and who would not condemn sexual perversion of various kinds. We saw the same sort of thing take place in Indiana Yearly Meeting over the past 15 years. I once said that my ambition was to give my name to a separation among friends. Hammite separation has not taken off, but I was involved in the reconfiguration of Indiana Yearly Meeting that resulted in the formation of the new Association of Friends, of which I am now the clerk.
I thought that was the new Association of True Friends.
Ah, I like that. We're thinking about changing the name, but I mean, if Western Yearly Meeting can still be Western Yearly Meeting, even if it ceased to be the westernmost yearly meeting of Friends in 1872, we can go on being new for 100 years.
Well, I've been suggesting we change that name to Best Western, but no.
Okay. Well, there's a lot I have not touched on in the time I have. The formation of groups like the American Friends Service Committee, the Friends World Committee for Consultation, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Generally, those are groups that are embraced by the more liberal Friends in FUM, FGC, and the conservative yearly meetings. What do we make of all of this? Well, obviously, Friends have been contentious. We have been diverse. We continue to be diverse. This has often been an occasion for lamentation among Friends who mourn what Quakerism might have been if we had remained united. We'll never know that. Counterfactuals are impossible to arrive at with any certainty. I think it's just as likely that maybe at least some of these separations, the separations themselves, not always the manner in which they took place, that maybe these separations have been a way that God intended to keep alive some important strain of Quakerism that might have been submerged or de-emphasized or even lost in the larger body. Second reflection that comes to me is that in an increasingly contentious world, in which the ways in which people apparently these days in American society and American politics rise to positions of leadership and prominence through their genius for demonization and division, that it's important to us to hold to our values. There continues to be a place in American society, in the larger world, in people who speak for the teachings of Christ as devoted to peace. The war, while it may be inevitable in a broken human world, is never the will of God. That we should continue to seek ways to prevent the occasions for war, whether it be physical conflict among nations or cultural conflicts within societies. Secondly, I think it's even more important for Friends to be models of integrity, of truth speaking. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that truth speaking, on the one hand, has to be wishy-washy and bland, and on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily always have to be inflammatory. Former President Earl of Doug Bennett said that from time to time, as president of a Quaker college, he had occasion to think he really wished sometimes the Quakers had never invented the phrase, speak truth to power. Because inevitably, when he heard it from students, it was a criticism of some decision he had made, trying to balance the interests of competing groups and not doing as they wanted done. I certainly think that this is a world in which Quakers need to speak truth to power, but they should also need to recognize that speaking truth to power doesn't mean that it always has to be spoken in the most incendiary, inflammatory way possible. There's a place for Quakers to be countercultural, but at the same time, not so counter that they lose all touch, all ability to speak with those who disagree with them. Finally, I think we need to remember that Friends have believed that there is a divine light in all people, and that most people, even when we disagree with them, can be reached through that light. I'm reminded here of the experience of an English friend named Porter Catchpool, who from 1934 to 1938 headed the Friends Center in Berlin. He was largely concerned with trying to help Jews escape from Nazi Germany. And he wrote that his experiences there made him realize that sometimes in our virtue, our desire to do good, we've become so convinced of the evil of those who differ from us that we're actually pleased when they do evil because it fulfills our expectations for them. He said he was led to make a point of actually befriending Nazis, believing that even Nazis still had that light that sometimes could be reached, and that on a number of occasions, he was able to arrange exit visas for prominent Jewish leaders from Germany because of those ties that he had formed with Nazi leaders. So in short, it's not easy to be a Quaker these days. There are all sorts of things in the larger world to make us question whether we made any progress over the past 2 centuries. Yet I think we have a duty to persist. And on that note, I'll say I'm done.
Fabulous. Thank you.
I think I went a little long.
That's okay.
You've inspired me.
Yeah, I'd say we still got 5 minutes for questions though,
Okay.
or so.
Yes.
First, a little housekeeping. I'm gonna put a tray here. You can leave your cups there and the dish fairy will eventually do something.
Could you get me a drink of water?
I can do that.
Thank you. Yes.
George Fox have anything to say comparing like the light of the Bible versus the inner light?
Fox certainly believed that the Bible had a place in Christian life, or Christian life. Yet he also said repeatedly that the same spirit that inspired the writers of the Bible still inspires people today. The Bible is one emanation of that spirit, but it's not the only emanation of it.
You wouldn't go with the sun and the moon.
No, no, he would not have embraced that view. Or if he had been asked, he would have said that the light was the sun and the Bible was the moon. Thank you. Have I left you speechless? Yes.
Could you speak briefly about Central Yearly Meeting and its place?
Central Yearly Meeting formed in 1925. It was centered on Union Bible Institute, which was one of several fundamentalist Quaker Bible colleges that came into existence between the 1890s and the 1920s. In the case of Central Yearly Meeting, it was centered on that Bible Institute in Westfield, Indiana, which had taken over the old Quaker Academy there. The leader in the formation of Central Yearly Meeting was a minister originally from Ohio named William M. Smith. And he basically believed that the 5 years meeting of Friends and Western Yearly Meeting of Friends were hopelessly contaminated with liberalism and modernism. He was particularly outraged that Western Yearly Meeting had a connection with Earlham College, where critical study of the Bible and Darwin's theory of evolution were taught. And so in 1925, he led Friends in Western Yearly Meeting, mainly in Hamilton County, who thought as he did to form a new yearly meeting, Central Yearly Meeting, which continues into existence to this day. And if you want to experience old-fashioned holiness revival Quakerism, that's the place where you're most likely to find it.
What is the, say, relationship these days between FUM and FGC? Isn't there a lot of more cooperation than there once was?
There is generally a good relationship between FUM and FGC. There are several yearly meetings like New York and Baltimore and New England, Southern Appalachian, Southeastern, that belong to both FUM and FGC. And that in turn has been another source of tension in FUM, because you get people, say, from New York yearly meeting, where it, is just taken for granted that we will perform gay marriages. They meet a fundamentalist-minded friend from Iowa who is horrified by this. We have to work through this. And that explains why there's been an exodus, like Indiana yearly meeting, out of FUM in the past decade. Yes?
Through conversations with my grandson, who's searching, he introduced me to the Buddhist thought, and I investigated and I saw that there's kind of a movement of Buddhists and Quakers coming together. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, sure. Again, liberal friends in the 20th century have felt it quite appropriate to acknowledge the divine, or at least spiritual good, in all religions. And so you can see why a religion which was based on silent waiting would see affinities with Buddhist traditions of contemplation. So, that's why you would find today some people who would describe themselves as Buddhist Quakers.
Zen Quaker.
Or a Zen Quaker, or, even Jewish atheist Quakers.
Probably should quit so that we can have tech support a moment to gallop in there and switch.
Good enough.